Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining. My name is Courtney Lobel, and I'm the Chief Development Officer at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to another session of MEI's virtual briefing series on the crisis in the Middle East, which this week will focus on access to the al-Aqsa Temple Mount complex in Jerusalem and the dynamics at play during Ramadan in the context of the broader war. Since October, MEI has been working hard to provide you with expert analysis on every dimension on the ongoing conflicts in the region, and we hope this series has been a valuable resource to you and your colleagues. This week, I'm delighted to welcome two highly regarded MEI experts to the series. Khaled Elgindy is MEI's Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Palestine and Palestinian Affairs Program. Danny Seidemann is an attorney who specializes in legal and public issues in East Jerusalem. He has argued over 20 cases before the Israeli Supreme Court and is widely recognized as one of the leading experts on contemporary Jerusalem and Israel and by the international community. He has also been a close friend of MEI for many years. So thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
The al-Aqsa Mosque Temple Mount complex is the third holiest site for Muslims and the holiest site in the Jewish tradition. Access to the site is strictly controlled, which has spurred tension, discontent, and violence in Jerusalem for decades, especially during religiously important times of year. Danny, we'd love to start with you and get your view from Jerusalem. Specifically, why haven't we seen violence in Jerusalem so far? And what is the situation on the ground at the moment?
Well, let's begin with the recent past. And in the recent past, Jerusalem in general, but particularly al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, has been the epicenter of the conflict, increasingly so. And as recently as May 2021, events at al-Aqsa, Temple Mount, Damascus Gate were the direct trigger of the last round of violence in Gaza. So there is a deep relationship between what takes place in Jerusalem and in Gaza, and the events in Jerusalem, and vice versa. From day one, everybody expected Jerusalem, East Jerusalem, to explode in violence, given the scenes of carnage that we're witnessing in Gaza. And the deep affinity which exists between the residents of Gaza and the Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. That did not materialize, and the reasons for that are complex, and I'm not sure that I know all of them. And this is a matter that I'm discussing with Palestinian friends. But the question in general about Jerusalem is not merely what's happening on the streets of East Jerusalem. That's extremely important. But what's the dynamic at al-Aqsa and the Mount? Before I give you a precise or a detailed discussion of what's happening, it's important to bear in mind that there is a deep relationship between Gaza and al-Aqsa. And al-Aqsa has been quiet since October 7th, as has East Jerusalem, much to everyone's surprise. Why the most compelling answer that I can give you in general is because the Palestinians of East Jerusalem have decided, for numerous reasons, this is not the time to challenge Israel in a way that will lead to violence. Having said that, people were expecting that there would be a conflagration at al-Aqsa. Now, when the war broke out, everybody's paying attention almost exclusively to Gaza. And those who were not paying attention to Gaza were paying attention to Hezbollah in Lebanon in the north, and then in the West Bank. But everybody in a position of authority looked at what was happening and said, we do not want to be in a situation of war, of active combat, of devastation, conflagration, against the backdrop of Ramadan at al-Aqsa. And that is precisely what's happened. And it remains relatively quiet. Why is that the case? Let me describe a few of the changes that have taken place in general, which have assisted this, but I want to emphasize al-Aqsa is not embroiled in violence because there has been a grassroots and leadership decision in East Jerusalem for various reasons. This is not the time to mess around. Having said that, what have we observed at al-Aqsa? Number one, the numbers of worshipers are way down. From almost 100,000 on an average Friday, they plummeted to 10, 15,000. And all of this is before Ramadan. And the question is why? Well, the answer is because the West Bank is sealed. There's a closure. There is a shutdown of entrance from the West Bank to Jerusalem in general. And that would bring tens of thousands of worshipers from the West Bank to Jerusalem. It is sealed. Secondly, in East Jerusalem, among the Palestinians, there's an age limitation. And that age limitation said only men above the age of 45 or below the age of 10 will be allowed access. And that meant that many tens of thousands of Palestinian young men and women were denied access to prayer on Fridays. And they would pray on the streets. They would be stopped blocks away from the old city. And when stopped, they would not waive their right to pray, but they would pray on the street and would not proceed. And there were clashes with the police, not terribly harsh, but they were there. And finally, for any of you who have been to Jerusalem, if you stand atop the Mount of Olives on any Friday noon, you'll see kilometers of buses lining the old Jericho road. Those are Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Arabs, who come by the many tens of thousands on Fridays. They're a devout population and they are deeply attached and committed to al-Aqsa. They have not been coming. They've stayed away. So the numbers have made things less volatile. Now that's a huge bet because it comes at the price of an enormously frustrating cap or barrier before Muslim worshipers to pray. It's a wager that has worked so far. Secondly, East Jerusalem is pretty much under unofficial martial law. Ben-Gvir's police has turned into a private militia, and that is so in the demonstrations in Tel Aviv. It is doubly and triply so in East Jerusalem. That is not the case at al-Aqsa, which is remarkable because it's the same police. When we observe, as we do, the police have been less aggressive, less repressive than what we have seen in the past. The only conclusion that I have from that is Ben-Gvir gives the police orders on everything except the perimeter and what's happening at al-Aqsa, and that is vested in more responsible hands, likely the Shin Bet and the Prime Minister's office. The numbers of Jewish visitors have also gone down for all sorts of reasons, and the police, as opposed to the recent past, are holding them on a very short leash. They are not allowing any provocations. So as a result of that, when we would receive play-by-play description on what's happening at al-Aqsa, it was as calm as one could expect, perhaps more so, and that the behavior of everybody was more restrained than what we even saw before the war, until now. Over the last few weeks, our illustrious Minister of National Security has been trying to use al-Aqsa in order to ignite a regional conflict. There's no question about that. He thrives on this conflict, and al-Aqsa is his arena of choice. And there has been a very public debate about his insistence to prevent access of Muslims, particularly the Palestinian citizens of Israel and those in the West Bank, to deny them access. It's been splashed all over the press. He is doing it not in spite of the fear of a conflagration, but in order to cause that conflagration. It's easy to say that Ben-Gvir is the problem, but Ben-Gvir would not be doing this were it not for the tacit and sometimes explicit consent of Netanyahu. Ben-Gvir is the symptom, the problem is Netanyahu. Gratefully, the Israeli security establishment, the IDF, the Minister of Defense, the Shabak, have all weighed in and said it is vital for stability to allow for maximal unimpeded access. And they said it in no uncertain terms. And until now, that is an argument that they've won. Before closing up these not brief enough comments, it appeared very likely that this was going to blow up on the first evening of Ramadan, a week ago Sunday, because the police were being aggressive in the old city, near the old city. It was clear that they were doing Ben-Gvir's bidding. They were denying access. They took out their billy clubs, their batons, and beat people. And I personally sent out a warning that if this persists, the fear of a regional war is not misplaced. It wasn't an accident. And the goal of this was to create enough of enough rioting or response or whatever to justify shutting down the mosque. Whatever happened the next day, it was different. From then on, the mosque has been open, unimpeded, relatively. Palestinians in the West Bank are still denied access. But beside that, it has been uneventful. Now, it doesn't make al-Aqsa less controversial, less volatile, less dangerous. We still will be fortunate if we go through Ramadan without violence. But to the extent that one can say Jerusalem and al-Aqsa respond well to treatment. And treatment in this case is, in spite of all of what's taking place in the background, allow maximum access and a minimum perception of threat, that the sanctity of the site and the ability to worship are threatened. It's not ideal, but it's been good enough so far, and I hope it remains that way. But it's not a solution.
Thank you so much, Danny. It's so helpful to hear your perspective. Khaled, can we bring you into the conversation to add to those comments on this set of issues, and also your view from Washington as the director of one of the only Palestine programs here in DC?
Yeah, thanks. Of course, Danny's absolutely right when he says there's this intimate connection between Jerusalem and Gaza. And they both have a lot in common historically, at least in terms of the recent past. It's not a coincidence that Gaza and Jerusalem have been the two flashpoints, the two sites that are most likely to see recurring violence over the past more than a decade, at least. And of course, they are connected, as Danny pointed out. Sometimes directly. You know, we saw how the situation in Jerusalem quickly spilled over in 2021 into Gaza, and we've seen the reverse happen as well. So that connection is very important. I think it's heightened by the fact that we are now in the month of Ramadan, and you're going to have people who want to reach the Al-Aqsa Mosque for religious reasons. That's that's normal. That happens every year. In terms of why maybe the numbers are down, I think just to offer some thoughts on that, or why we haven't seen a major explosion in violence this time around, especially given the situation in Gaza is quite horrible. People expected, there was some expectation of a ceasefire deal before Ramadan. Obviously, those have evaporated. It's still possible sometime in the coming weeks, but we just don't know if or when. I mean, eventually there will be some kind of deal, but it could be weeks, it could be months. And so the carnage that people are seeing in Gaza, I think, is also a deterrent for a lot of Palestinians to say. So when they say this isn't the time, I think they understand. They're looking at a government that is quite extreme, with some very unpredictable forces. They've demonstrated in Gaza and elsewhere that there are no real red lines. We've seen hospitals attacked. We've seen starving people shot at in convoys. So I think there is an inherent understanding. We've seen starvation used as a weapon on a mass scale in Gaza, and I wouldn't discount the impact that fear and repression have on a population. I think people are quite attuned, and there are no restraints right now in Gaza or elsewhere, and so I think people are much more reluctant to start something, even if it is relatively small. We're not talking about even armed attacks, but even something that could easily escalate. So I think there's a real disincentive there, just simply out of fear. I think the past 6 months, especially, has instilled a degree of fear in Palestinians. There's enormous repression. There are enormous restrictions in the West Bank. There's daily violence in the West Bank, people being abducted, people being killed on an almost daily basis. And so I think people are, for the moment at least, kind of much more circumspect and much more cautious about what they're willing to start. That doesn't necessarily mean it will hold. I mean, everything can, I think everything has its limits. If Ramadan, we're still relatively early. I think we still have another 20 days or so. Anything can happen. But I do think that the measures that Israel has put in place, the restrictions, the ban on males between ages of 10 and 45, that's pretty significant. And of course, discouraging others, and just the inability of West Bankers to reach Jerusalem is another factor. But who knows? I mean, the situation is always unpredictable. But for the moment, I'd say repression and violence and fear are quite effective.
Thank you so much, Khaled. At this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to our callers on the line. To ask our speakers a question, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. Keep your hand raised until I call on you and unmute. Then kindly state your name and affiliation and let our scholars know who you were asking your question of. You're also very welcome to ask questions on topics beyond the subject of today's call on this regional crisis. You can also submit questions in the Q&A chat box on Zoom in writing, and I'd be happy to ask them of our speakers. To start us off while people are getting their questions in the queue, I'll start with one of mine. How have other outside actors voiced their opinions on the al-Aqsa restrictions during Ramadan and during the war? And how is Israel assessing these opinions that may be being voiced by others in the region, other countries in the region, other groups? Khaled, do you want to give a start?
Well, that sounds like a question for Danny. I mean, in terms of which actors, the international community?
Other countries in the region, groups active in the region. Danny, over to you.
Okay, a brief story. In early December, during the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, there was supposed to be a march of ultra-nationalistic religious youth associated with Ben Gvir in honor of Hanukkah through the Muslim quarter of the Old City, where it is customary for people like these to shout death to the Arabs as they pound on the doors of Palestinians cowering in their homes and before chaperons. The police announced it would happen. We're going to allow it. It's Ben Gvir's police. And when the date came, a few hundred turned up for the demonstration. And they started to proceed to Damascus Gate, and they were pushed back by the police. And they started negotiating, and they tried to force their way through. They made it as far as Newgate, for those of you who are familiar. Weren't able to enter and were pushed back. And then they said to police, almost in despair, okay, we'll go through Jaffa Gate. It's not terribly hard. No, the police didn't let them budge. Now, that baffled me because the approval of this march could not have taken place without the knowledge and consent of Netanyahu. And preventing Ben Gvir's police from allowing this is a decision that only could have been made by Netanyahu. And apparently he said, no march. The question is why? And my answer is hypothetical. But it is clear that major international engagement at the highest level told Netanyahu in no uncertain terms, don't dare. Whatever they said at work. I was told, and I'm not sure it's related, that President Biden, who clearly was aware that this act could spark a regional war, spoke to Netanyahu a couple of hours before this march. Is it related? Is it not related? Nobody tells me, and that's fine. It's an indication that when there is international engagement and it's timely and robust, it works. For the most part, the international engagement is tepid to non-existent. One of the things that perhaps Khaled can share with me, or with us, because I'm not sure, it is more apparent to stakeholders in the Arab world, and I'm talking about the Gulf and particularly Saudi Arabia, that you ignore al-Aqsa only at great peril to yourselves. I would be very surprised if we arrived Ramadan without some of the new players who have normalized with Israel weighing in. They have not been terribly forward-leaning in dealing with Palestinian interests, and that's being polite. But I think that there may have been some behind-the-scenes engagement with people with Israel, that the countries that Israel are dealing with, regarding the do's and the don'ts at al-Aqsa. But again, all of this is conjecture, but I can't imagine the situation being as stable as it is. And I'm not telling you it's stable, and I'm not telling you it's good, but as it is, were it not for some very firm international engagement.
Khaled, did you want to come in on that point?
Yeah, sure. I think I don't know if there are specific interventions by Arab states, but I think it makes sense to assume that there are, because the administration, this is one of the areas where the administration feels that they can have influence, as opposed to Gaza, where there's just sort of kind of banging their heads against the wall on aid delivery, killing less civilians, all of the things that, all of the demands that Israel has not met in Gaza, that have been so frustrating for this administration, and which they're not really willing to use a lot of leverage. So I think for the administration standpoint, the West Bank and Jerusalem are kind of low-hanging fruit, relatively. And for Netanyahu, I think also there's a similar calculation. Okay, I will give up some things here and there, the march in Jerusalem, try to maintain some calm in Jerusalem in return for, as part of a trade-off where he has a much freer hand to operate in Gaza. So I do think the administration is weighing in on these issues. It quite well could be in part because they are hearing directly from Arab governments, the Saudis in particular, but I don't know. But it makes sense, and I think it's consistent with the administration's own self-perception, where they feel that their hands are tied in Gaza, in essence because they've sort of tied their own hands, but have a much freer hand in places like Jerusalem, and are willing to expend a little bit of political capital there, just given the stakes. If they can keep things contained to Gaza, they see that as a win. And as long as it doesn't spread to Jerusalem and the West Bank, or to the north, in Lebanon, I think they see that as a very high priority.
Has Hezbollah made any statements about, or I'm sorry, has Hamas made any statements about restrictions to al-Aqsa? Have they voiced any opinions on this publicly or on social media?
Yeah, again, I'm an Israeli. I don't speak Arabic, and I am reluctant to speak in the name in any way with my friends and colleagues in East Jerusalem. But a couple of weeks back, Hania, one of the leadership of Hamas, called upon the Palestinians in East Jerusalem and the West Bank to march on al-Aqsa on the first day of Ramadan. And I asked my Palestinian friends and colleagues, a number of them, and the response was pretty much uniform. Cool. He wants to march on al-Aqsa, let him march. We'll watch. Now, that does not mean that there is anything less than total devastation and anger and pain among the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. Looking at what's happening in Gaza, they have deep connections, but it means we know that what we hold dearest, al-Aqsa, is precious, but it can also be manipulated. You want to manipulate, do it on your own. We're not going to be cast in the role that Hamas has given us in central casting. It by no means it indicates any less concern and rage over the carnage in Gaza.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat for both of you. It appears that the violence that was expected has not materialized due to fear on both sides that it would spiral out of control. Is there now a concern that this might lead to a de facto new norm of heightened repression? And that since the expected violence has not materialized, the US and EU and others will be content to simply ignore more repression going forward?
I mean, I would say there's always that risk. I do think I think there's merit to the argument that if this is now the new norm, then maybe just everyone will just adapt and get comfortable again and complacent. I think I suppose if it stays quiet for a long enough period of time, and that time is something that resembles stability, then yeah, we could go back to a very complacent response from outside actors, including the United States. But I do think October 7th and the horrors in Gaza have awakened something in the establishment in Washington. There's still quite a lot that they're in denial about. But the idea that that either the situation in Gaza or in Jerusalem will simply fade from from focus, or sort of fall into the background, or remain quiet indefinitely. I don't think that's something that the U.S. and other actors are taking for granted. And so I don't think they particularly are. They're not necessarily looking at it in terms of, well, this heightened repression is bad, and therefore, because it's wrong, or it's immoral, or violation of people's rights. But they're looking at it as something that is probably not sustainable on a permanent basis. You can maintain a degree of repression, but at a certain point there is overreach, and then there's going to trigger a response. It's just a matter of when, and I think people's levels of alertness to that danger is much more heightened now. I think it would be hard even for Washington to be complacent in this environment, but I could be wrong.
Danny, would you like to come in on that point?
Yes. Intimidation is certainly part of the mix. And this is not me going over to Palestinian friends and saying, hey, are you afraid? Are you intimidated? No, people are telling me we don't let our kids go to school alone. We escort them. And that's part of the mix. But I don't believe it's the decisive part of the mix. On the second day of the Second Intifada, 2000, September 2000, I had a chat with one of the greatest American diplomats that I've ever known, the late Ron Schlicker, who was Consul General in Jerusalem. And we were discussing, what the hell is going to happen with this. And his response to me was, among else, Danny, you're going to beat the hell out of the Palestinians. There's no doubt that militarily you have the support. But remember one thing, you are not going to buy the Palestinians with humanitarian aid, and you are not going to break their will. You will engage with them, or this will never come to an end. And I believe that is true today as ever before. If anybody thinks that there is a stable equilibrium in Israel-Palestine, not only against the backdrop of the carnage in Gaza, but with 40% of Jerusalem occupied by Israel, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. If tomorrow morning, God willing, inshallah, may it please the Lord, there's going to be a ceasefire. If there will be a ceasefire that does not address the metastasizing occupation of Jerusalem, the countdown for the next round of violence will already have begun.
Danny, there's a question. Oh, sorry, Khaled, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that point. I think Danny's right, and I think there's another factor here at play in terms of what is dissuading Palestinians from sort of mobilizing in any meaningful way. Part of it, as we already discussed, is kind of fear and intimidation and repression. But another part of it is, and this speaks to the difference between that moment that Danny referenced more than 20 years ago, and now. The difference then is you had at least the trappings of a credible political leadership, a Palestinian leadership. And so there was a sense, and this was also true in the first Intifada, if people are going to go out and break that barrier of fear and go out and sort of put their lives on the line, and rebel, that they have a political leadership that will back them up, that will be a sort of safety net, that will be able to take advantage of any political space that is opened up by that kind of a mobilization. And you don't have that now. You don't have a credible leadership either in the form of Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, or Hamas, frankly, for that matter. And so that anecdote that Danny mentioned about, well, sure, it's easy for Hania to say, go out and mobilize, show up at al-Aqsa, but what's his plan for the day after that, right? When the Palestinians get beaten or shot or killed, or then what? I mean, the stakes are much higher now because there are much fewer constraints on what Israel is willing to do. And so no one has a plan. Hamas doesn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan for how to respond to October 7th. They don't have a plan for al-Aqsa or Palestine in general. And certainly the PA leadership in Ramallah also has no plan. And so I think it really reflects this a lack of confidence in their own political leadership, and political actors. Who's going to pick up the slack when we go out on a limb and take these risks? And right now there isn't anyone. There isn't the international community. They can't count on, certainly, watching people, international community kind of wringing their hands and watching people starve in Gaza without really intervening. So they have no faith in them, and they also have no faith in their own leaders. And so I think that's a recipe for really just doing nothing, until one of those changes, until there's some kind of new political leadership or some dynamic that changes on the domestic front. I don't think we're going to see a lot of Palestinian mobilization.
Thanks, Hala. That's really interesting insights. And we have a question in the chat for Danny that covers the flip side of that, which is, Danny, you mentioned a rift in the Netanyahu administration between Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir and the defense establishment over Temple Mount policy. Can you elaborate on this? Is it a rift that might grow as the Israeli opposition gains ground against Netanyahu's grasp on power?
I will put this delicately. Nothing good will happen as long as Netanyahu is prime minister. He is driven by one consideration, and one consideration only. It's his political survival. There are some very bad people in his coalition, and there are some moderately decent people. It doesn't make a difference. Netanyahu is all about survival. Netanyahu exhibits the same empathy towards hostages as Trump did toward the victims of COVID. And he treats the strategic threats against Israel the way Trump treated the threat of the pandemic. I believe there is the opportunity and the indications of a major shift in Israeli public opinion, which will not bear fruit until Netanyahu is gone. I'll sum it up in this way. Israeli society reinvented itself twice since January of 2023. Hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, took to the streets to prevent a judicial coup d'etat and succeeded. When the war broke out, we Israelis discovered that government really didn't exist, that the governmental agencies that are supposed to provide for us have been gutted out. And it is Israeli society that has been taken up and filled that void. There are many voices in Israel today that are saying the day after Netanyahu, we will have to found the state of Israel for the second time, not a minor reboot. We have to reestablish the state of Israel. Does that mean that occupation is going to be prioritized? No. Does that mean that arguments that Khaled and I will be saying will be for more intensive years? Largely no. But it will be a pivotal moment to be seized in which, Israelis don't go abroad these days. We stay home because we have loved ones who are either hostages or in the military, whatever. Nobody's not affected. But as a result of that, we have no idea how much support of Israel has collapsed in so many places that we counted as our own, not among our enemies, but our friends. We're going to have to sweat to get support that we pocketed in the past. I, for one, am pleased with that. We should earn the support, but it means that the day after this, we're going to be confronting a lunar landscape with total devastation, unspeakable horror, and we'll start over again. What I'm saying is there will be what to work with that day. It's not going to answer the questions. It will provide an opportunity.
Danny, thank you so much. We're coming up on the 45-minute mark, so I think we'll wrap up now. But thank you both so much for your extraordinary insights. This was a really illuminating discussion, I know, for our callers. Thank you to everyone on the line for your questions. If you have a question you weren't able to ask, please email them to development@mei.edu, and we'd be happy to send them to our experts who can answer them at a later time. Thank you again, Khaled and Danny, for participating in this week's session. If any of you on the line have missed any of the sessions we've done since October each week or wish to watch them again, you can find the recordings and transcripts of all our briefings on mei.edu/briefing series. Thank you again for joining us for this week's session, and please be on the lookout for an email invitation to next week's briefing. Thank you all very much.